Welcome, everybody, to today's Scientist Rebellion talk with guest speaker, Professor Amy Woodson-Boulton. Amy is professor and past chair of the Department of History at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. She's a historian of Britain and Ireland, working on the cultural reactions to industrialization, including the history of museums and ideas about nature and so-called primitive art. She teaches modern British, European, and global courses that focus on imperial, cultural, public, and environmental history. And she's also co-founder of Historian Rebellion. So we're very excited to have her today. Amy's talk will last for about 30 minutes or so, after which there'll be ample time for a Q&A. Then there will be a short talk about Scientist Rebellion, upcoming actions, how I can get involved. And then we will end with 15 minutes of breakout rooms, which are based on your location, so you can talk to other people in your broad area. But without further ado, we're very happy to have you here, Amy. Please take it away.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. It's so exciting. And I have to say, I love it, having just joined through Historian Rebellion, joined Scientist Rebellion, and gotten to know some of the people. It's great to see some familiar faces and names here. It's wonderful to already feel like part of this community. So this is maybe a little bit of, I feel like it's a little bit of an unusual talk, but I think what kind of was wanted was a little bit of a something like an intellectual journey, but also kind of thinking about how we can all use our professional and academic expertise toward the climate movement. I actually think this is a lot harder than most people think. And I see and I feel a fair amount of resistance around whether the natural sciences or social sciences or history. People feeling like, oh, but can I do this? Is activism my side thing, or can I somehow combine my professional life and my activist life? And recently, as I've been thinking about my own journey anyway, I mean, even before being asked to give this talk, I've been thinking how much for so long in my life, I thought of myself as an activist outside of my professional life. And what's happened more recently is that I've been able to combine them more. And that has been enormously satisfying. And I also think it's what's needed on a much broader scale. So I want to talk a little bit about that because my first book, I like to call it my first book because I'm working on my second, but my first book, Transformative Beauty, Art Museums in Industrial Britain, which came out with Stanford University Press, does not, I think, necessarily sound like a climate or an environmental history book. But the more I've thought about it, and I kind of knew about it at the time, of course, but the more I've thought about it, it is part of the intellectual journey that has led me to become more and more involved in the climate movement and getting Historian Rebellion together, because art museums, and hopefully you can even see it in the cover, my choice of cover image, art museums in Britain were absolutely part of a reaction to industrialization. The kind of sense of ugliness around the people founding the museums was part of why they thought that the working classes in particular needed spaces of beauty. And art and nature were absolutely intertwined in a lot of British thinking. One of my favorite lines from a letter in my book was when William Morris wrote to one of his fellow museum founders. He wrote, "Educate your workmen into discontent." And I think that idea of opening people's eyes to the ugliness, to actually having them see the ugliness, is very much actually what Scientist Rebellion and Historian Rebellion are trying to do right now, to get people to see that we don't have to live like this. There are alternatives, and that those alternatives have been cut off from us very deliberately by very powerful interests. Now, of course, the idealists who were trying to found the some of the idealists behind the museum movement really did not succeed. So I don't know if they're a great example for us, because really a lot of the people controlling the museums ended up being the liberals who wanted to show off their wealth so, so as with many things, they ended up being kind of a mixed bag. But with this, for some ways, very radical. Now, my current work is on the history of anthropology. And of course, I am building on my work on art museums. This is a recent article that came out, Totems, Cannibals, and Other Blood Relations. And this is more directly tied to ideas about nature. In this piece, this was really about animals and thinking with animals. But as I've been thinking about the history of anthropology, its embeddedness with imperialism and colonial relationships, and ideas about who was closer to nature and who was farther away, I feel like I'm almost watching British thinkers and curators and founders of ethnographic museums and writers and writers of popular fiction all think through and define being modern and being industrial and really creating a fossil fuel world. But what all that meant was being far away from nature. To be modern was to be far away from nature, and to be primitive was to be close to nature. And that I see it over and over and over again. And I think part of that, again, that I want us to think about, I want us to try and talk about with other people, I talk about with my students, is the amount of work it took, cultural work, not just building the train stations and the railroads and the viaducts and the factories and the coal mining and the extraction and the colonialism, but the cultural work. What was the cultural work to create an idea of being modern that meant an industrial society, a capitalist society, and defining ourselves through consumption and distance from nature. So again, that kind of realizing, oh, this intellectual journey I've been on, so much of this, in fact, is about the creation of our modern industrial world. A few years ago, well, I should say really over the last 10 years, I started teaching more and more public history and bringing my expertise in museums to teach museum studies classes. And then with the suggestion of my friend and colleague, who I think is here, Professor Elizabeth Drummond, she suggested I teach environmental history as well. We've been teaching a global history class, modern global history, for a long time. And she thought, I think you would enjoy doing this as environmental history. And she was so right. And she and I loved teaching this class so much that we ended up writing an article about it together. And this is just the title, Teaching Modern World History, or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Embrace the Urgency of Climate Change. And I think one of the things that teaching environmental history has meant able to bring a much more activist stance into my classroom, in the sense that it is something that is absolutely on students' minds. They are absolutely worried about this. All they hear is doom and gloom or denial. Those are their two options. And in fact, and I think everyone on this call, wherever, clearly your expertise has brought you here in some way, shape, or form. If you are in the fortunate position of being able to teach, I think teaching is one of those opportunities, one of those moments where you can, in ways that don't seem necessarily obvious at first. Sorry, my son just came in and I was very distracted there. Oh, sorry. This is what it's like being a mom and a professor. That was just a little moment there. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. So I was saying what you can do to teach. I know I should have had him really run across so you could see that he was really there. I don't know what he was doing over there in the corner. He's gone now. But if you can teach a subject in such a way, or your subject in such a way, to think about, to bring in climate change in some way, shape, or form, and this is one of my big messages for this evening, is to think about the fact that climate change, because climate change is an interdisciplinary problem with an interdisciplinary solution, the more we can be explicit about addressing it in our professional work. And that means teaching, that means at university service, that means in broader communities, and that means in our research. The more we can do that, the more we help build the movement. So for me, teaching and the way we titled our article here, How We Learn to Stop Worrying and Embrace the Urgency of Climate Change, is to not teach the history as if it's some long dead or even academic question that doesn't really affect us. Is to say, no, this is affecting your lives. You, the students who we are teaching right now, this is your future we're talking about. So what does that mean? And what does it mean to say the way we tell this story? As historians, we're deeply attuned to narrative. How are we telling that story? Did it start with the invention of the steam engine? Did it start with actually, as I would say, in fact, much, much farther away, much longer ago, with possibly the European invasion and colonization of the New World, with the development of Atlantic slavery? How do we tell this story that affects how we think about things, right? And how we think about the solutions. So I want to talk about then what it means to say, okay, let's embrace our expertise, take charge and say, we are going to be activists in our approach and not shy away. One of the things we can do, and this is a great example, this event this evening, is building connections. So for example, a number of years ago, we organized 2019, you can see, the history department at Loyola Marymount University organized this event, Design for Disposal, the Making of the Global Plastic Crisis. And we were able to invite two experts, Susan Frankel, who wrote a wonderful popular history of plastic called Plastic: A Toxic Love Story, and Joshua Goldstein, my co-conspirator on Historian Rebellion, to speak to plastic. And we brought in the students from journalism were really interested because Susan Frankel is a journalist and they wanted to meet with her. History students were interested, environmental studies students were interested. It was a really great event. And at dinner that evening, Joshua Goldstein and I started talking, and I was like, we're just so fed up, and we're like, nobody's doing anything about climate change. And we both said, what we'd really like to do is join Extinction Rebellion. Well, that was in 2019. So just hold that thought, because one of the things that happens when you start reaching out to people and say, let's do an event to highlight some, is that you build connections, right? When you follow your interests. Whoops. So for me, one of the things that happened also is that I have been active in local organizations, Indivisible for one, which is an American organization, progressive organization that emerged around the election of Donald Trump. But I was also became involved in a local organization called Ban Single-Use Plastics. And in going to one of their meetings, one of the leaders of that group said, she'd really like to put together a PowerPoint presentation on how plastic is a threat, not just to the environment, but to human health. She's herself as a medical doctor. And so we dug in and we just started doing research. I said, I can do PowerPoint. I do PowerPoint. That's like all I do all day, right? Is PowerPoint. It's not all I do, but you know what I mean? I am well versed in PowerPoint. And we dug in and we did a ton of research, and we had an event for fellow activists. She has a wonderful network of fellow activists across California and some on the East Coast as well. And we presented the work and we shared the PowerPoint, and we said, please spread this, use these slides, use the information. We've documented everything. We have our sources. We've put all the facts in. Use this in your own advocacy. That work, and you're seeing I'm even recycling my images here. That's how much I believe in recycling. The organization, which is an arts organization, which I know through my work in 19th century cultural history. They wanted me to do a talk about John Ruskin, and I thought, perfect. I can sneak in my plastics talk while talking about this Victorian thinker, John Ruskin. And it worked beautifully. And of course, because they have a network of like-minded people, I have now been invited to give this talk to a place in a society in Scotland. And I'm working on other British organizations to get this information out there. So one of the things that I urge you to think about is local organizations, local networks, what networks are we not thinking about to bring people in beyond just our usual suspects talking to other professors or other academic bodies, but people who are active in the community, and who are the people that we need also to gradually join us and eventually, right, like hit the barricades or hit the streets or hit the protests, right? This is, I think, really crucial. So that brings me to historian rebellion, and is a really good example, again, of expertise in activism. Not my own, though. This was the action, the April 6th action in Los Angeles, with Peter Kalmus and Greg, who I think is also here this evening. I saw this action on Twitter where a number of scientists got arrested in Los Angeles and spoke out against climate change. And I thought, this is it. This is what we should be doing. And messaged Peter on Twitter and said, okay, we should start a historian rebellion. If you have a scientist rebellion, we need to get other rebellions going. And I contacted Joshua Goldstein, right, who I'd met a couple years before. And we were like, let's do it. So then we just start putting out feelers. It's not, we are in the midst of making this. Historian rebellion is in very much a work in progress. But the fact is that right now we have 30 people on a chat who at least are thinking in terms of rebellion, are thinking in terms of realigning their work towards climate change, and are thinking in terms of how could we work together. Joshua and I took part in a little action with People versus Fossil Fuels, a banner drop over the 110 freeway when Joe Biden was in town. And, you know, when the reporter asked me why I was there, you know, holding this banner over the 110 freeway that said Joe Biden, you know, People versus Fossil Fuels, Joe Biden, make a choice. The look on her face, the surprise when I said I was a professor of history, right? It was not what she was expecting. I don't know if I didn't particularly look like what she thinks a professor of history looks like, but the point is that whatever social cultural capital we have, this is how we can leverage it, right? It's really, I think it's a crucial moment. So then that action and my joining Scientist Rebellion and Historian Rebellion and starting these conversations got me invited to an event that Renata Sponer organized in Panama. And I think Renata is here as well. This is what I mean about the community, which was an amazing event. And to me, I mean, it was quite, you know, I think in some ways she said, well, what I'd really like is a history of the world and our dependency on fossil fuels in 15 minutes. And, you know, it was challenging, but also great. It's a great challenge. Say, okay, let's do it. History of the world in 15 minutes, boom. But combining that with the work of the climate scientists, the ecologists who were on that same event, and the fact that it was in Panama, the fact that it was multilingual, the fact that it reached different people. And then of course, Fabian saw that recording, and then that's how he invited me here. So one of the things I hope you're seeing is the way that building networks, building connections, using your expertise, leveraging your expertise, and combining your expertise and your activism is something that yields many, many unexpected dividends, right? And that's what building the movement looks like. And even when you're not quite sure where it's going, right? Because I don't know that we necessarily know where it's going, but that always with the goal of bringing people in, and always with the goal of getting people to think in a slightly different way about, for me as a historian, I think the thing I always want them to think about, people to think about, is this does not have to be the world that we have, right? This does not have to be the world. People made this world, people can change it, right? That's how we got here. But the message of doom, or the message of denial, or the message of inevitability, that plays right into the hands of the powerful who want to keep us silent and want to keep things the way they are. So I think the more, and everyone on this call has expertise that is going to be bring your own unique insight and way of approaching this, right? Like what is in your particular field how is climate change affecting what you do, how you tell and narrate the progress or the collapse or the development or the shift or the change that you are witnessing in your own research. But I know that many academics have felt like, ooh, but I can't really speak out, right? Because that's like my professional work, and I could be an activist, but I don't want to be an activist, and I should recognize the collapse of tenure lines, the fact that many people are in contingent positions, the fact that, I know that changes things, and I've been very lucky to have tenure and to be in that position. So of course, I'm not asking any of you or suggesting that you should risk your, possibly precarious position. But what I am saying is that there might be ways of using the position that you have in ways that could be a little creative and that are absolutely within the bounds of academic work, right? Academic discourse. So why do we need you? What does it mean to be part of scientist or historian rebellion, or a rebellion of any kind? Because, as I said before, this is an interdisciplinary, like if ever there was an interdisciplinary problem, climate change is it. And there is no way that we are going to solve it without bringing everyone along with us, right? This requires all hands on deck. And as I said at the beginning, my own work as a cultural historian, one of the things I explore is that you don't have an industrial revolution, you don't have imperialism, you don't have capitalism without a huge amount of cultural labor. Cultural work makes that possible. So that's why we need the engineers and the artists and the designers and the scientists and the historians, right? That's why it takes all of us. Why do we need you? Again, because these are really complex systems, and we need to understand the natural systems, and we have to understand the social systems. None of this is inevitable. And again, a narrative of inevitability that I think we see more and more, this kind of doomerism, is again playing into the hands of the powerful who really want to maintain the status quo. Contingency, on the other hand, that's something that social scientists study all the time, historians study all the time. One of the things that I think folks in the natural sciences can help us understand is these are complex systems. When you affect one thing, you affect other things, right? And they're not necessarily one-to-one, right? You can flip off the Gulf Stream and suddenly change the oceans, change the currents, change the weather radically. So that kind of complexity, I think, is something that we can all bring into conversation and treat our fellow citizens around the world as adults who know this. And especially, of course, people in the global South who have been living with this for decades already and have been trying to sound the alarm. And then I need you because I firmly believe that it is moving toward combining expertise and activism that's going to build the movement. And it is building the movement so that it is not all of the usual suspects doing the work and not the usual suspects at the protests, so that it's the people, it's the neighbors, it's the people who maybe show up for a library meeting or a city council meeting. It's the people who call in because they're unhappy about the parking. It's getting everyone to think that this is their problem. Because one of the things that happens, I don't know how many Douglas Adams fans I have here, but one of Douglas Adams' best, I think most brilliant ideas was that the best cloaking device for a spaceship is a somebody else's problem field. And for a very, very, very long time, fossil fuel industries have worked to get us all to think that climate change is a somebody else's problem field. It's absolutely not your problem, right? So part of the message is it is our problem, right? It is our problem, but they're also solutions. They're also solutions, and they're doable. And again, humans made this, humans can solve it, but we need to act. We need to act now. But I think the message of doom is one that is too easily becomes one of inaction. And of course, the message of denial is one that I mean, I think there are a lot of people who seem to be going directly from denial to doom. It's just, I think, again, really interesting. So I can't wait to hear what you're all doing and what questions you have. Again, this was a kind of brief exploration of my own journey, but I hope that what you take from it is that you may have more avenues for action than you realize. For a long time, I felt really overwhelmed and unable to do anything, but the communities that exist that are gathering are what absolutely will sustain you. And that, in fact, is the only thing that kind of keeps me going and gives me hope. With that, I'll close, and I can't wait to hear what questions you have and where you'd like to take this conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy, for this great overview and this personal story. If people have questions, you can either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and then we can call on you. Maybe you can also just unmute. Sarah, please.
I'll unmute. Hi, Amy. So I'm Sarah Finney-Robinson, and I am the founder and director of the 51% Project, which is at Boston University. And one of the great principles that I've identified and worked with is called the trusted messenger. And maybe you all know about this. The Yale group, Tony Leiserowitz's team, does a lot of work. Ed Maibach is one of the leading scholars on trusted messenger. And here's the most recent chart, which is so interesting that I actually printed it out. And what it does is it shows registered voters across party lines. Who do they trust the most? And I want to tell you that the number one really in aggregate is NASA as a brand. So that's, that gives us Peter Kalmus, right? He's a NASA climate scientist. So that's just great. Historians aren't even on here yet, but I would think that decorated PhD style historians, tenured like you guys are, would be right up here. And I just wanted to let you know that you're ready to enter the trusted messenger pantheon. And I will leave it at that, but I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation, and I hope we can meet regularly like this, and perhaps that would be a way to really expand, and we can all bring in 6 more people, whatever. And let's get some best-selling author historian types too. And
yes.
Documentary.
Definitely. Thank you, Sarah. It's lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And your son, the bomber.
Fantastic. Excellent. Yeah, it's good to connect.
Yes.
Are there any other questions? Justin, please.
Okay. Amy, thank you. This is very inspiring. I wonder if you have any qualms in terms of professional ethics about combining teaching with activism. It seems to me, that we have a certain responsibility to present different points of view in our teaching. So I think you get the question. Okay, how do you navigate that?
Well, I think as a historian, this wouldn't be, I don't feel like I'm manipulating the history that I'm teaching. And I feel like one of the ways that we get around that is by always relying on primary sources, right? So we're always rooted in the time period that we're studying. I don't have to manipulate what the conquistadors were saying, or what the slave traders were saying, or what the Victorian, they're all pretty out there in terms of saying what they. I think what I do say at the beginning of my modern global environmental history class is I'm taking climate change as a given. I'm not debating that. To me, that is settled science, and that's not up for debate. We could talk about why people have made it a question, and we could look at the history behind that, but that's not, we're not going to kind of waste time on that. and I've certainly had students who identify as conservative. I mean, I've had kind of run the gamut, but I think what's interesting is that they are so open. For instance, so like one of the things I think for me, things like, where does your food come from? What is soil? Why is fertilizer important, right? Like these are just things nobody has taught most students. And once they start thinking about it, oh, right, like they start getting really interested in soil and really worried that it's a non-renewable resource, right? Like that this is something that takes a long time to produce. But I think, everyone has to be, you're going to have to judge your own situation. As I said, I don't want to, I'm not implying that everyone has as much professional freedom as I do as a tenured and promoted professor. But in my own experience, I don't feel like the activism is warping my work in any way. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I see there's questions in the chat popping up too, not to forget.
Yes, I think Greg had his hand up before, and then Everett.
Hi, everybody, and hi, Amy. Thanks very much. Great talk. Great to hear your thoughts on historian involvement. I'm a scientist, member of Scientist Rebellion, and I'm wondering, I'm hoping that historians and related workers have new or different thoughts than about what would be a successful kind of tactic and what constitutes a successful campaign. Scientists, we don't really have this deep understanding of history, and so we don't know what might work. I'm wondering if you and other folks have thoughts about new kinds of tactics, or perhaps criticisms of tactics that are currently being checked.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that is difficult is a lot of the organizing right now is happening in places that are very comfortable. They are not themselves being affected. And so, I went to actually a really wonderful civil disobedience training that was using the model of the civil rights protests and the use of nonviolence in the American South. And, one of the things that, the people organizing, the Black organizers who were so careful and so smart and so canny, they were a group who had very clear aims and were very aware of the problem. So much of our problem right now is that people around the world are suffering, but they're not the people that we are often trying to reach. And they know there's a problem, right? Like we don't need to tell the people in Bangladesh that climate change is real. So, I mean, I think this is something that Historian Rebellion is talking a lot about is, how do we connect? I mean, one of the groups that I've been really impressed with, well, there are two, I will say, Debt for Climate, I think, and I think they came to speak to this group at one of your previous talks. I think they have a message that is really clear and has a very clear, here's the problem, here's the solution, right? I think that's important. And then People versus Fossil Fuels is a really impressive organization that we've been working with, who I think also are really trying to put forward Indigenous voices in particular. So those are some of the organizations so far as we've been talking that we've been really impressed with in terms of having very clear agendas and also deep roots in terms of community organizing. But I think sometimes I know, and I've seen all the discussions and I feel it, like a lot of the scientists are like, but the science, like the rationality, why are people not listening? And believe me, like I totally get that. I think one of the things that hopefully historians can do, and journalists and humanists, and I saw the, this question about humanist rebellion. I mean, yes, we need everyone, is to think about, why do we get stuck? I mean, actually, because it goes back to the other question. We met with Amy Westervelt, the climate journalist. And one of the things you talked about is getting stuck in this both sidesism, even when the other side is just complete, you know, fossil fuel industry propaganda. So yeah, I think we have to think about how to get around some of that. And some of it may feel uncomfortable because we've been taught that we have to do both sides, you know? So yeah, anyway, sorry. I hope that started to address things, but in terms of, I don't have an answer.
I think this was great. And you also touched on the humanist rebellion. So I'm considering this answered and move on to Stephanie. Or Stephanie.
Yes, hi. I'm Stephanie Rach from Germany, and I'm a veterinarian, and I've been active with Last Generation here and Scientist Rebellion, and just lately, 2 days ago, we did a solidarity action in Bayreuth for Deaf for Climate. And I think it's great to connect internationally and between the movements. That's the only way. But I fear we won't get very far if we won't be able to get the working class on board. And I'm wondering how we can do that, because now it's still us and them. And we need them in this boat, because without them and without people working in civil services and all the rest, we need to get them united. We need to get the trade unions within the international movement, and very fast. So how can we manage this?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I absolutely agree, and this is again one of the things that has been the most remarkable political shift, is how some often very conservative political messaging has continually appealed to and been used to conquer and divide and conquer. One of the things that I think, one of the books that I've read by someone who's very historically minded that I recommend, this is in a US context, but is Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. Heather McGhee is somebody who worked at the Foundation Demos and has developed what she calls the race class narrative. And one of the things she makes really clear is that a lot of the kind of us versus them, and even the framing, let's say, of something like environmentalism. Well, let me say first, many environmental movements historically were very elitist, right? So that's one thing, that's one problem. Like, let's keep this nice patch of beautiful wilderness just for us so we can come, at least in California, right? Right, let's go, we can go on the weekends from San Francisco, so we would like to be able to visit Yosemite. You know, that was certainly true. So that's on a lot of white environmentalists as well, or game reserves, or right, there's this whole history. But one of the things that Heather McGhee points out is that the kind of zero-sum discussion, what she calls the zero-sum story, is, well, you can't have both clean air and high wages. You can't have both clean water and high living cost, you know, low cost of living. So part of the question is, how do we combat that? And it is, you know, what she calls, like, how do we really envision a multi-ethnic democracy? Like, how do we really think multi-ethnic, multi-class democracy? And that's, and I'm not, this is not easy, right? Like, this is us about how do we join up labor? How do we join the fight for 15? How do we support workers, even if it's not our? How do we support Black Lives Matter, right? How do we show up? How do we listen, which is not necessarily always easy for academics who are used to talking, but how do we show up and listen and find out what we can do? Oh, thank you, Everett, for putting the link to The Sum of Us. Yeah, it's just it's a fantastic book. Again, US context, but I think with really some really valuable lessons. And I love what Anita is saying about food. I mean, a lot of the kind of, you know, well, one of the things that People versus Fossil Fuels is talking about, which again, I think could be, they're US based, but I think it could apply internationally, is when there are, you know, if the narrative is inflation, high oil prices, high food prices? To what extent are supply chains disrupted, not just by COVID, but now by climate change? To what extent is drought affecting production, food production? To what, or any kind of production? To what extent are power outages the fault not of renewable energy or reliance on wind or solar, but in fact our power lines going down in high winds, which are more frequent and causing forest fires? So one of the things that People versus Fossil Fuels is talking about doing, and I think this is a great model, is to think about how could we use incidents or disasters or weather related or otherwise to bring attention to climate change, right? And to point out, in other words, that people are already being affected. So anyway, those are some kind of scattered thoughts, but I just absolutely agree, Stephanie, that these are, it's going to have to be a cross-class movement, and that's that is definitely part of the challenge.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Sarah noted in the chat something about electricians rebellion, and I quite like the idea, because we have we have scientist rebellion, we have Doctors for XR, with historian rebellion, which are still in some sense elitist organizations, right? So you have to have a PhD and so on, medical education, but getting the working class on board, maybe that's a way in, as Greg Spoon also noted. Julia, you had a question earlier. Do you want to ask it yourself, or should I go ahead?
I am happy to read that out. I've noted that there has been a response already. My question is, well, to start with, it's pretty hard to get scientists into the media to get their message out. Even when we had some quite high profile actions, the media coverage was less extensive than we would have hoped. And it's even harder to get that message out accurately. So how much do historians get into the media? How often do you see a historian interviewed on the breakfast news, and how can we make that happen even more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that, again, the climate journalist Amy Westervelt brought up with us that I thought was really interesting is how much is the goal of an action to get the action covered, like the fact of the action, like, wow, people from the kind of upper middle classes or the middle classes are doing this thing that seems awkward and embarrassing, or like putting themselves out there and they're kind of speaking out in some way. Or how much is it to say, get the actual, like, we need action on climate change? And I think that is a really helpful way of thinking about it. One of the things that we're talking about at Historian Rebellion, after speaking with Amy Westervelt, is how much can we be working with climate journalists, not to be interviewed necessarily on the daily Good Morning America or whatever, but how much can we be providing background information? How much can we be helping shape the narrative and helping draw out issues that are not otherwise getting covered? Again, op-eds to your local paper is a great, that's a great way too. But yeah, I mean, breaking into the media is definitely, that's and it's not strange, because again, that kind of framing of both sides tends to be, well, if we talk to somebody who thinks that we need climate action, we need to talk to someone who thinks we don't, or who thinks things are fine, or who, right? So that's also part of the issue. So again, that's why I would say one of the things about working through thinking about networks, not social networks, but not just social media, but your local communities, people who are interested, who are not necessarily academics, again, thinking about how we reach people. I'm not suggesting we solve climate change by talking to people one at a time, but I am saying that we are going to need to build the movement, not just through big actions, that we do need actions that bring people in, but we also need talking to people, meeting, working together, joining up in different ways.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
there's a very specific follow-up from Everett. Just in general, how much is public humanities work in bridge building publications like GLARP or the conversation getting through?
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, I think I have to say, I think I recently signed up for the conversation, and I think it's fantastic. And that is, I think, a wonderful outlet. I don't know. I mean, it is tricky to know how much that is preaching to the converted. On the other hand, one of the things that I hope is that and I know personally a lot of public facing work, I can end up using in classes, for example, whether they're, it's podcasts or articles, and I think that's true for a lot of people. So, it's reaching not just the audience, not just necessarily the subscribers, but yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting, I don't actually even know how many subscribers the conversation has. I'm sure I could find out. It's a good question.
Any other questions or comments for Amy? Otherwise, I would have a quick one, shifting gears to the teaching you've been doing or done on global environmental history. And I'm basically just wondering, how are the students, or how you navigate, it's a lot to take in, right? First of all, this emergency, the crisis, but also then realizing the long shadow, colonialism, and Amit of course talks about this very nicely in the Nutmeg's Curse. How do students take that up, and how do you make sure that they're not okay, doomed, or
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it helps because it really is a history class, and we really do start in the year 1500. So a lot of what we're doing is not, but having said that, one of the things that I talked about in the article that Elizabeth and I wrote together is I actually start with the concept of the Anthropocene and some of the problems around that. And thinking about getting them to even just think, and a lot, because this is a new concept for many students, is to think that history is a narrative and you can tell history in different ways. There's a classic work that actually blew my mind when I was an undergraduate about different ways of narrating the Dust Bowl, which was, to me, that was like the beginning of my kind of, I think, really thinking historically, right? You could tell it. This is a William Cronin essay from 1992, and he said, you could tell this as the triumph of the human spirit over adversity, or you could tell it as people came to the plains and tried to farm in ways that were completely inappropriate to a very thin layer of oil. And so really this was a human-made disaster. So thinking about narrative for students kind of gets them thinking, oh, like how are we part of a narrative right now, right? Like how are we part of it? And then how do we apply that to the primary sources that we look at? But I also have them start thinking about, and this is very much, from my own work, but what do they think nature is? And, even for the environmental studies students, many of them are like, wow, nature is nature. What is it's nature. Well, are we nature, right? So in other words, once you start thinking, well, actually, this is a series of categories. These are histories, right? And you can tell the history of these things. I think it helps them approach then this long global period in a different way. And then what they see is that so many of our problems are really, really, really recent. They're really recent. And so once they see that, they're like, oh, I mean, it's not that it is, oh, well, then we can fix it really easily, because they also see that these things have a really long, it started a long time ago. But when they think about some of the really recent things, it's like, look, again, people made these problems, people can change them. And how are we being limited? One of the most powerful days I do with that class is I call it rehearsing our own extinction, and I have them bring in excerpts or trailers from their favorite apocalyptic movies. And they realize that they've been fed a steady diet of apocalyptic thinking since they were little. And that they have just assumed that the future is going to be like Blade Runner. The future is going to be like the Hunger Games. And it's really interesting to them to think about, well, why did people stop writing utopias? you know, why aren't we imagining a good future? How would that change if actually we spent as much time writing dystopias as writing utopias, or even just put a little thought into some utopian thinking?
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the techniques that I found are really effective. And again, the cultural work that has gone into creating our moment.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for the talk and the conversation. Now we'll have a quick talk about scientist rebellion, and then there's going to be room for Q&A. And Amy, feel free to stay on or leave if time's short. But thank you again so much for this. And I'll hop on here. Can you see my screen? I hope so.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Well, let me briefly talk about scientist rebellion, the motivation, upcoming actions, and how you can get involved. And I want to keep this short, and so I'm not going to talk about the scale of the emergency or the recent and ongoing extreme weather events, the brutal heat waves, or the scientific articles that keep coming up telling us it's worse than predicted. Instead, I want to focus briefly on the science and policy interface, where we see a failure of communication, a failure of listening of historic proportions. And this is a prime example. This is the last sentence of the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 2 report of the IPCC, saying that any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. This is a sentence for the history books. And it is the scientific community telling policymakers that if we do not act quickly, we are fucked. And all governments approve this sentence. However, while these reports have become more stark in their language and more dire in their warnings, this is nothing new. And so the next graph almost breaks your heart, showing that we have known about the problem for decades. We have convened about it, talked about it in conference after party after conference after parties, and we've barely made a dent. And even now, in the era of loss and damage, where climate impacts are more severe and widespread, governments are continuing on the path of destruction. And the litmus test is fossil fuel expansion. So here's Fatih Birol, who's the executive director of the International Energy Agency, not a particularly, quite a conservative institution, saying that if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal from now on, from this year. However, governments, as the production gap report shows, are planning to produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 that will be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So here you have the production consistent with 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and you have the plans and projections. So this is the epic failure of listening and of communication, where you have the scientific community for decades screaming at policymakers that we're heading towards catastrophe, and yet governments influenced and bought by fossil capital are failing to act commensurate with the scale of the challenge. And so here we are in 2022, in the critical decade that will determine the future of humanity, and we're running out of time. And so as scientists and as academics, we cannot continue to be bystanders writing our articles, publishing in obscure journals, but we have to rethink the role of scientists and engage with how social change happens at a massive and urgent scale, as we can't allow science as usual. And past struggles and the social science indicates that one way to force rapid action is through mass civil disobedience. And this is not retweeting things or, again, writing some academic paper, but this is getting out there, getting on the streets, and this will require a struggle. But if there's no struggle, there's no progress. and power concedes nothing without a demand. So we have to build social movements across sectors and demand change. And Scientist Rebellion comes in here. It's not only an organization that endorses civil disobedience, but it's one that engages in it. So it's a global movement of scientists and academics, from PhD students to full professors, who engage in civil disobedience. So to publicly, consciously, intently, non-violently, peacefully, breaking certain aspects of the law, to express the fact that we are not standing by the destruction of the living world, the destruction of our hopes and dreams. And there's something powerful when scientists, especially senior scientists, engage in civil disobedience, because as we heard earlier today, they're one of the most trusted groups in society. They have a wide network and access to media, and they can support other civil disobedient climate groups. And there's a responsibility here as well for us, for those who know the scale and the urgency of the emergency, to act. And Scientist Rebellion, you might have heard, has in April, accompanying the Working Group 3 report of the IPCC on mitigation, over 1,000 scientists and academics in 28 countries took to the streets and engaged in, blocked government ministries, corporations, engaged in academic strikes, teach-ins, street theater, and that led to mass arrests in multiple countries, global press coverage, and it put Scientist Rebellion a little bit on the map. And here you see that there are many local groups now in the Americas, in Africa, in Europe, in Australia, engaging in local struggles and mobilizing their local communities. And a bunch of these local Scientist Rebellion groups are getting together for October for a big action. And the idea here is to concentrate forces on a single country in Europe, to collaborate with many other civil disobedience groups, to join forces and to engage in a campaign with repeated actions until a demand is met or everybody is arrested. And at the same time have solidarity actions across the globe. And this is going to be huge, because it has to be, because we're in the critical decade that will determine the future of humanity. Okay, so we're born into this juncture where we're either steering towards collapse or creating a much more equal, much more healthy world and society. And it's a little funny to be born into this moment in human history. And there's a scene in the Lord of the Rings I think about a lot in this context. And it's Frodo who says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And then Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." And so I encourage you to get involved with Historian Rebellion or Scientist Rebellion. And we posted various things in the chat how you can get involved. And involvement on all levels is needed, not only to get out there, get onto the streets, hold the banner, get arrested, but also a lot of back office, a lot of graphics design, organizing these types of talks, mobilization, talking about it with other colleagues in the academy. So I'll leave it at that. Please get involved, and thank you.